let's talk about the mixer brush. Now, this is going to be different from all of the other brushes that we've been dealing with up until this point, because it uses all of the same brush dabs and strokes and capture brushes and modeled brushes, all those things. It uses that. It's actually a different application of those brushes. So I've built a quick fan brush and I've made a new layer here. I was playing around with some of the splats. And this is just a standard little fan brush. See, it's not doing anything too special or amazing. I can grab the stylus and have a little more control over it than I would with the mouse. And that's about it. So I can lay down paint. Now, the way that Photoshop handles smudging is that it just grabs pixels and kind of pushes them together. And we can do something like sample all layers. So now if I grab a brush, you'll see that it just kind of smudges it, but I could also grab a specific brush, like the quick fan brush I created, and we'll try to smudge all that stuff around. So you can do some weird goopy things, but it's not particularly useful. I mean, you can get these great effects. I've just turned off the underlying layer, and you have kind of a turpentine style smush to everything. But what if you wanted to have more of an authentic brush effect? Something like you were painting with acrylics or oils, and as you moved that around, you would want to have, for example, the effect of the paint picking things up and sliding things over. Well, that's why they've readapted the smudge tool, combined it with the stamp tool, and created this hybrid and loaded it under your brush. So if you click and hold on your brush, you have not only the brush tool, but you have something called the pencil tool, which we've gone over, the color replacement tool, which we will not be talking about right now. We'll be dealing with that sort of thing when we get into color, and the mixer brush tool. Now, this is the appropriate time to deal with the mixer brush. Let me go ahead and grab that beautiful quick flat brush again. And before I do anything, I'm actually going to shut stuff off, and we will deal with it one piece at a time, because it's somewhat more complicated every update, it seems, than it has been in the past. So I'm going to begin with a clean layer, and you can see on this layer I don't have sample all layers on. So as we saw with the smudge tool, it was generating all these colors based off of what was below it onto the layer that we were working on, the active layer, because we had sample all layers on. This has the same kind of capability, as does the stamp tool, and we'll talk about that later. Not in this set of videos, though. I'm going to just turn off everything, all of it. It's all off. And we're going to start here and work our way up. So starting with the brush, you can see that I've got the fan brush in with my Wacom pen, which again does not support rotation. It does have tilt. And we'll just do a quick brush stroke. And I'm going to hit X on the keyboard to flip those colors around. Notice up here we went from this purple to this pink, because I have down here the background and foreground colors. Pressing X is just toggling between them. And so nothing seems to be different. Well, that's because I have all of the settings off, except for load. Now, this is important. At the moment, load is at 100%. That means that as I paint, I can paint forever. If I drop the load down to something fairly low, like say 3%, and paint, it lasts quite a long time, but eventually it will paint away and fade off. In fact, it lasts a very, very long time, partially because I have other settings off. So this may not be the best demonstration for it, because without things like mix, it's not going to load them all in. Sufficient to say, load will control how long it takes to fade away the original color. Now in this event, with everything off, it's isolated, so the color stays forever. So we'll go ahead and crank this back up to 100% for now. We'll come back to that later. Now I can paint with pink and red, right? And that's it. It's normal brush. Go ahead and turn up wet, and you'll see much different behavior. It's now smudging, or seemingly smudging, between these two colors. At this point, load will have an effect. Let's grab an all new color. And we will crank the load down to, say, 2%. And you'll see the blue fade more and more and more and more as time goes by. And in the newer versions of Photoshop, this lasts a lot longer than it used to in the older versions. So heads up, like I said, they do keep changing things. It's kind of insane. So I always recommend playing with this particular brush before you use it, simply because it will have a slightly different effect depending on what Adobe's been up to. Now we also have mix. If we knock down mix and we just have our load up to 100%, and we have a very high wetness, you'll see that it's not really mixing for very long. It starts to rebuild the paint that we have selected. Let's crank mix up to 100%. Watch this. Our paint's gone. But we know that because we have the load up to 100%, we should have plenty of paint to work with. It just fades away very quickly. Mix is a reference to how much it's pulling from its source and how much it's pulling from the canvas. So at 0% mix, it prefers the source. And so it will keep loading back in that source again and again and again. Where at 100% mix, we're going to get the opposite result. It does not particularly like the source and instead will work off of the canvas. Now again, this is affected by wet. If we tank wet down to 0, you'll notice that it can't do any mix because it's literally just coming from our source. So if we have any amount of wet, we will have mix available to us. So you'll want to kind of use mix and wet in conjunction. And this is my first complaint about the mixer brush. Those should be next to each other because they don't really work in isolation. They work in conjunction. But they really did want to have load ready to go. If you lower the load down and you have a relatively high mix, it will quickly switch over. So you can kind of control that, how long it will take depending on your load. So 100% and 60, and let's load the load down to 14% and 60. It becomes a rate at which it's changing. At least in this version of Photoshop, they may change their minds. Nothing's sacred when it comes to Adobe. They really don't care how used to something you are. They're just going to change their mind and change the settings. So watch out for that. Okay, so we've got those, but there's even more. That barely scratches the surface here. First off, we have two more settings. We have load the brush after each stroke and clean the brush after each stroke. Now, before I get into those, let me show you one other thing. This dropdown has a number of presets ready to roll for the mixer brush. So for example, you could do a dry light load, dry heavy load, moist light load, moist heavy mix, wet light mix, wet heavy mix, very wet light mix, very wet heavy mix. Well, now we know what these do, but here are some of the ones that the engineers just have off the bat. I just kind of wanted to show you these real quick so that you can see what they choose to use. Now, that said, I think 10% wet is a little high. It's going to get a lot off of the canvas very quickly. I think you really only need like 3%. And you're good to go. You'll be able to paint more controlled lines without worrying about it. I need to crank up the mix though a little bit. There we go. Now with the load set to 50%, you'll eventually run out of paint. So I'm just going to leave this at 100%. And if you watch me use the mixer brush in other videos, I don't have any up right now, you'll actually see that I tend to have the wet very low and the load just cranked up all the way, because there are other more interesting uses for the mixer brush than to have it smushy all over the place. We're going to make a new clean layer. and show you another interesting thing before we get over to this, because it's going to matter. The sample on all layers, notice with it off, it's still trying to pick up what's below just a little bit, or at least it seems to be, but that's not really the case. In fact, if we turn off everything, where's this little goop coming from? It has to do with this essentially palette. Notice that it has a tiny, almost minuscule dot in it. If we click and zoom in, we'll see that we have more than one green paint. And in fact, we have this blue paint that got picked up. Well, where did that come from? Now we can talk about these two brushes. It has to do with load the brush after each stroke and clean the brush after each stroke. And if I remember right, the earlier versions of the mixer brush didn't have these, so you didn't have to worry about it. But let's clean it after each stroke. And all of a sudden, we don't have any paint at all, even though we have a load and a mix. Well, what's happening there? I see I've got a color, but this sample doesn't have one. So what? Oh, it's the other step here, which is load the brush after each stroke. Well, now it's a pure green glob, and it's still a pure green glob. Let's switch it to our pink. And you'll notice because of the mix that I have going on, and the I can't just paint down this vibrant fuchsia like I could if I painted off. I have to mix it in, and if I keep clicking, it will eventually build up. And you've got options like your, much on the airbrush, the enable airbrush style effect buildup, which makes it a little faster, but given the type of brush that we have, I still have to wiggle around because essentially it's only putting tiny little dots in places, so we can't see the effect very well. So for this bristle brush, you're not going to see it, but for other bristle brushes, you'll see it a lot better. Say that 10 times fast. Okay, so let's try it without the clean after each stroke. And we'll paint through the green and we'll release. Now notice, and again, this is minuscule. Do it one more time, make it a little bigger. We have a spot of green in our fuchsia now. Without cleaning the brush after each stroke, it will add to our palette in a somewhat unique way. It will continuously resample what we've smudged together, and it will add and mix that in. And we know that it's occurring here because I have sample all layers off, and even beyond that, I have no other layers on. Even if I had some colorful stuff everywhere, it's not actually picking up any of the greens from in here, and I can prove that further by loading up one of these guys from earlier and coming back, grabbing a new layer. Notice that green smudge is still in there. That green doesn't occur anywhere in our airbrush strokes. That is some contamination that was added on purpose by Adobe. And I think it's interesting that Adobe did that, and I think it's nice that they allow us to remove it by cleaning after each stroke. Now the key here, though, is that if you don't load the brush after each stroke, it's essentially not coming back to this palette. So now with the wetness, I've got 3% wetness that I can drag in from other colors, and then the load and the mix will also occur. The 3% wetness in conjunction with the mix, so we can knock this down to show you what I'm talking about. The load will still have an effect here. If I knock this down, it still takes forever in this version, it will eventually run out of paint. And you can see it getting a little thinner as it goes, or it should eventually run out of paint. I'm going to go ahead and crank this back up to 1%, and I'll leave the mix up a little higher. Let's go ahead and sample from all layers. Now I have clean after each stroke, and I have the load brush after each stroke off. So I'm going to clear up this layer by selecting all with Control A, hitting delete. Okay, watch what happens. I can do a really amazing smudge effect way faster than at the beginning of this video. In fact, I have extravagant control over everything that I'm doing thanks to the wetness and the mix. So if I increase the wetness a lot, you'll see that it affects each other far more heavily. And if I increase the mix to use much of what's on here, oops, cancel. I got that backwards. It will sample off of it. Did I get that backwards? Hold on. No, I did not, because there is nothing to mix with. It's a transparent deal. I got it right the first time. Okay, as you can see, even I get confused when it comes to some of the settings of the mixer brush, because I'll be honest with you, I don't use it as much as I should. It's a very, very powerful tool, and it's great for emulating things like oil paints and acrylics, anything that has some kind of turpentine-like ability on it where you can pick up and smear things. Now keep in mind this is an all new layer, so if I were to turn off the underlying layer here, there it is. Should have labeled those, huh? Look at that. Look at this creation that's occurred. Oh, beautiful. Save that. Yeah. Nice. Okay, so we've got all that going on, but there's still more. So remember how I said it was contaminating the colors? Let me turn this back on. So now the colors won't be contaminated. Let me duplicate this between strokes, because when I release, it's cleaning it. So I'm adding in a certain amount to it, even with the mix as low as it is. I'm sorry, the mix as low as it is means that it will add to it. For some reason today, I keep forgetting which direction means that it will sample from the palette rather than from the canvas. So sorry about that if I've said it backwards a couple of times. That's on me. Just watch the effect and you'll see what I'm talking about. There we go. So we've got all that going on, and we've remained beautiful with our fuchsia. But there's more. If you click this drop down, you'll see we can clean the brush and we can load the brush. Let's see what that's talking about. Let's say we don't have the automatic clean brush between strokes on. You can see that we're building up contamination in the center of our fuchsia. Now, if I click, you can see that it's mostly fuchsia still, but if I keep working with things, we'll start getting more and more contaminants in it being picked up on the brush. You can see that little blob getting bigger. If I kept at this for a very long time, it would take over a considerable amount. Still not very much because of all the fuchsia that we have. As I'm now getting a pink, you can see how big that hole is getting up there. So now we've got that and we're painting, and what if we don't want that contamination? Well, we can click here and we can clean brush. Now we have a fresh start, and we'll start picking up contaminants again anew, unless we have clean brush between essentially each stroke. We'll also have load brush. Let me show you what that one does. Say that we have cleared our brush, so it's clean. What if we wanted a pure fuchsia going in? If we come over and tell it load brush, it will pick the foreground color and push that right in. But let's watch something a little strange. Remember how I said that this is a combination of both the smudge tool and the stamp tool? It's capable of taking samples of other images. So for example, if I were to Google a copyright-free image of a bowling ball, and I were to produce a new layer, and I had sample all layers on, I have my fuchsia, which I can slowly paint up, and if I turn on clean brush, it will allow me to remove contaminants between strokes. If I were to hold down the Alt key with a normal brush, that would bring up the sampler, which allows me to pick colors out of it. Now, keep in mind that how it picks the colors is determined a little behind the scenes. If you want to know for certain, double click your foreground color and you'll see your color picker, and you have a point sample size. Now this should be the default when you just hold down the Alt key. It will cause, for example, if we uncheck the sample ring and tell it okay, I forgot to check this before the video, but I believe it's the same. It is. We don't have the color ring sampler around the eyedropper, whereas if I double click it and show the sample ring and tell it okay, now I'll have that ring around what I'm doing. And it puts this nice mid-tone gray, this neutral gray, so that it's separated, isolated from the rest of it. But if we double click it, here are all the settings. We're doing a point sample, which means where you click it is what you get. But what if you did something like take 3 by 3 pixels, a 9 pixel square, and then average that out? So if you had like, well, let's say 3 by 3 and half of it was black and half of it was white, it would average out to gray. And you can do a much larger one. Okay, so now we'll get, notice I'm right on this yellow dot, but it's still a median of the surrounding colors. That's because the point sample's different now. But the important thing is that with this standard brush, it's still just picking up one color, right? That's it, even though I'm technically sampling all layers. Let me double click my eyedropper to get back here and go to point sample. I could, instead of sampling all layers, I could sample current layer or current layer and below, or all layers with no adjustments. So if you want to see what it would look like without things like adjustment layers going on, that would do it. Current layer and below with no adjustments. So if I do current layer only, tell it okay, I can get all these colors because they exist on the current layer, but I can't get any of these colors because they're on the layer far, far below, the bowling ball layer. Let's go ahead and drag that up in our layer stack. So why did I show you all of this? Well, it's a good time to show where this is, just so that you know how to control all of these. I'm going to do all layers, so that's back to the default. But also, we can get that bright color back. Let me show you what happens. Oh, I'm painting right on my bowling ball layer. I don't want to do that. Let me show you what happens, there we go, with the mixer brush instead. So I'm going to click and hold on the brush again, and I'm going to go to mixer brush. I still have my beautiful fan brush. I'm going to alt click on the bowling ball. Oh wait, what's this? It's not the eyedropper tool. This is the sampler tool. So the sampler tool tends to be used with things like your stamp. Let me click on it. Well, wait, it's got a whole photo loaded up in here now of our bowling ball. Oh, well, that's a nice color, isn't it? And we can merge it all together using our mix controls and our wetness and all that good stuff. But where's it coming from? If we stop cleaning, it will become contaminated over time and we'd start having little dots going through. But what it's done is it's loaded up this image. And let me show you what I mean. Here's just a bowling ball. What is this? What is happening? Oh, let me show you. So let's recreate this strange effect. I'm going to clear everything out by Control A and delete. And I'm going to start with the classic hard round brush, which is just a brush, but you can see I'm like smudging weird gunk together now. So let's go over to the brush settings, and I'm going to turn down spacing so it's all separate. I'm going to come over to this bowling ball, and I'm going to make my brush about the same size. I'm going to alt click on it to take a sample. Oh, I failed to do so because I have sample all layers off. Let me turn that on. I'm going to alt click on this bowling ball now to get the bowling ball. Look at that. It's a chain of bowling balls now. Why is there a chain of bowling balls? Because that sample is the same kind of sample capture that you'd have for your stamp. It's not actually taking a pure sample by default. So if we did something like have it be completely dry and fully loaded, we just have bowling balls. And if we have it completely dry and partially loaded, we still just have bowling balls. We'd theoretically eventually run out of bowling balls. If we had it wet, we have slightly more transparent bowling balls because it's mixing them together. We've got bowling balls as far as the eye can see. This is crazy, right? It's amazing. All right, so before I get distracted by how wild that is, this means that it samples it by capturing a sample area, and then it works through it. So if we were to come back to our brushes and scroll on back down to our quick fan brush, this brush becomes, oh, sorry, let me bring up the load, bring down the wetness. This brush becomes a sort of mask to the bowling ball sample below it. You can see the picture just a little bit because it's taken a sample, this image, and it places it down, and then it smudges that sample together while picking up surrounding colors. That's how all this is working. Crazy, right? And with clean on, it's removing the contaminants, so it keeps going back to that original image. Some people don't like this. They just want a color when they click a color. Well, Adobe has done some alterations, and you too can set it up by going to the flyout and saying load solid color only. Now when I hold down the Alt, notice that instead of having the sample pointer, I have the eyedropper tool. So I can click on red, and now I have the red. Because it's not wet at all, it's just a pure solid red. There we go. Now I can start mixing in other things. And because I have sample all layers on, I can smoosh away that photograph of bowling balls. All right. In a nutshell, that is your mixer brush. You can spend forever just getting lost in mixer brush, but my suggestions are to usually work with very low wet and very high load, and you'll be pretty happy. I like some of the effects that occur with having the sample come in instead of the eyedrop, because I can not only get wild and interesting effects, but I can reload a solid color. So for example, I have my fuchsia, right? If I hold down Alt and click on this brown, I have a sample instead of the brown. But if I click on my foreground color, click on the brown, tell it okay, I've got my brown in, and I can do that every time I want. So I can either have a crazy sample, or I can do 2 clicks and have something else, the color, or more than that, if I have the color I want, I can do a crazy sample to start. And let me make this a crazier sample by clearing this out. I could do a crazy sample to start. And then I can click on the flyout. And remember, we have load brush. We can load back to that sample every time. And we can clean it and we can load it. And we'll load back to that last captured sample. I think that's amazing. But again, you'd have to click and fly out. I want to say in another version, you just have to reload the brush and it will bring in the color. So watch out for that. That changes if I remember correctly. I could also be misremembering. It's been a while since I've used this brush. Sorry, guys. So we'll kind of play around with it and we'll start getting these beautiful colors. Now, let's say we did have a great sample that we wanted to keep. We liked Bowling Ball Land. We wanted Bowling Ball Land forever. Well, remember back at the beginning of this series of incredibly long and thorough videos, I said that it's possible now in newer versions of Photoshop to save a brush with your colors. So watch what happens. Save the brush and include the tool settings and include color. And I'll say fan with small bowling balls. Now I've got a brush that's a fan with small bowling balls, and I've got a color sampled in on it. But you'll notice that the color isn't just that orange. In fact, to prove it, let's go ahead and turn these guys off. If I switch to like our snail, if I switch to a standard color, there we go, we got our snail. And now if I switch to this, it reloads that sampled bowling ball image. So I can store the colors every time. So that's about the only time I find capturing colors useful. It's with things like the mixer brush, where you want to record the sampled image as well. There you have it. That's the mixer brush. Those are all the brushes that we're going to cover for this set of videos. So up next is how to do this week's homework assignment. I will see you next video, and thanks for sticking around. I know it's been a lot of videos, but I hope you got something out of it. I hope you have a greater understanding of how the brush settings work in Photoshop. Okay, see you in a minute.